I'm excited to be here with clearly some amazing people and folks I dearly miss and am unable to have conversations with, both about debate and life, not as often as I desire. And so I'm looking forward to this for quite a few different reasons. We had a conversation quite a few months ago when we realized that we were not going to have a physical camp at Emory, and we wanted to figure out a way to continue to be supportive of folks who were going to camp and even those who were not, in helping them both prepare for going to camps and what to do with all of that information that you've received now that you've returned. So this is the third of 3 installments that we had. The first was for those who were not going to camp and how could they spend their summers. The second was what are some things that you can do to prepare for going to a camp. And now this one is, now that you've been to camp, what are some things that you can do? And so I am serving as the moderator, and most of my job is over now, and I'm turning it over to the experts who have spent a good bit of time preparing students to be at camp and also thinking about this particular topic. And I will let them introduce themselves. After that has occurred, I will come back, filter some of your questions that you have, along with some that I have gleaned based upon what they're talking about. So I will now turn it over to our amazing panelists.
I think that I'm supposed to introduce myself first. My name's Maggie. I'm going to be a senior at Emory this year, and I'm an assistant coach at Glenbrook South High School. So I'm just going to start off by sharing 2 pieces of advice I have generally, and then I'll help any questions throughout the presentation as Ed talked about. So my first piece of advice is when you go to prep for a tournament, especially the first tournaments, it's really helpful to set up a manageable work schedule for yourself. Working without the external motivation of camp can be hard, especially if you've committed to 7, 4, and 2 weeks of debate work. And it can be made a bit easier by committing to doing a certain amount of work per day or per week and carving out that time in your schedule so that you give yourself a certain amount of time for debate, and then also a certain amount of time that you can kind of take a break from debate, because that's also really important, especially with things being virtual, to avoid getting burnt out. The second piece of advice I have is that it seems like this topic is going to be huge, and that by Green Hill or the first tournaments of the year, you want to make sure that you have kind of your core generics together. So you want to make sure that you put together robust T files, your generic counterplans, a K that you're comfortable going for, and a politics or elections dissad. And if you don't have these things ready or feel like they need work, it's worth prioritizing and focusing on all of these things if you're a 2N, so that you can kind of have some flexibility, but also the ability to kind of debate all the new apps that I imagine will be proliferated at the first tournaments.
I think you get me next. Hello, my name is Kristen Lowe. I debated at Emory for 4 years. I graduated in 2017. I debated with Brian Klarman here for a year, who you're very lucky to be speaking to, as you are to all of these people. But since then, I have coached at the college level for 3 years. I worked at Harvard University, Northwestern University, and most recently and continually, I am the Assistant Director of Debate at Dartmouth College. I've also taught high school for the past, I think, 4 years at New Trier High School in Wilmette, Illinois. So a little bit of a college high school blend, but I also work full-time in an outside of debate job. So my 2 pieces of advice for you are related to what Maggie said, which I think is excellent advice. And the first one has to do with how do you set that schedule for what your work should be, and how do you take the camp experience and break it down before you dive into what happens at tournaments. So one thing I think is always really useful, regardless of what point of the year you're in, is to be quite intentional and goal-oriented in the way that you structure debate work. And right off of camp is a great time to do some introspection and reflection on your experience and ask, what did I get better at? How did I get better at that? And we'll come back to that. And what do I still need to get better at? And make sure you carry the momentum you built during camp for improvement and being reflective about your skills, and take that into the season so that that doesn't get lost in the shuffle of tournaments and rounds won and lost, et cetera. I think that question about how did I improve at camp is one that we don't ask often enough, and is something I would really encourage you to reflect on. Like, what drills worked for you? What didn't? When you had skill building, what was really conducive to working quickly through a new skill and what's taking more time? And you should set goals related to the new skills that you want to tackle for the year based on what works for you at camp. So for example, if transcribing OneAR is a really good practice for you to build efficiency, you want to set research goals along with practice goals that might involve transcribing a OneAR once every other week, but making sure that that practice is connected to an objective and it's a skill related, not an outcome related objective. I think by doing that, you can make sure you continually evolve your skills over the year, regardless of what's happening competitively. I think my second, less related piece of advice, but research related one, is the preseason is such an interesting time because you have camp files, you have superstitions about what's going to happen to the topic without a ton of knowledge of where things go next. And when you're doing research in that period, I find that you come across a ton of stuff that you don't know what to do with. You know that it's maybe a thing, you're not sure what it's going to be. And I highly recommend keeping a document of sort of miscellaneous cards that you don't know how to purpose and writing down your thoughts about how you think you could use them later, why they intrigued you, and making sure that you don't let go of a lot of the stuff you encounter early on in the year. I can't tell you how many times people I know end up breaking ass at big season-ending tournaments at the end of the year. And they're like, oh yeah, I found that in August. But it's because they keep good record of the stuff they have and they don't just let tabs disappear into a black hole of nothingness. So in particular, I think the ones you all should watch out for that can become really useful as the topic evolves are solvency cards or things that seem like they might be an ask or a counterplan. T cards that are outside of the scope of what you've already seen in the packets at camps, and anything that seems like it might be a category that was underexplored or neglected by the camp starter packs you've seen, the other evidence that's available online. So that's my research tips for you. And I think you got Shree next. Yeah.
Yep. My name is Shree Awsare. I'm an assistant coach at Emory and the director of forensics at North Broward Prep in Florida. I, like some of my other colleagues, just finished my last day leading a lab at a debate institute, for me, Dartmouth. My take on what to do post-camp deals with how to optimize the connections you made with your lab leaders and fellow students. So my first suggestion is true regardless of whether debate is conducted in person and online, which is that you should keep in touch with your lab leaders throughout the season. Debate camp is not typically a high-paying job. Most of your lab leaders give up weeks of their summer teaching students debate because they have a genuine love for the activity. And as such, a former lab leader is someone you can reach out to, and they can help answer questions about the strategic viability of an argument, review the content and organization of a 2NC block, or even listen to a rebuttal redo from time to time. As a high school student with zero coaching resources back in the day, I personally found my former lab leaders to be an invaluable source of knowledge to bounce ideas off of. And additionally, many of your lab leaders have connections with debate programs at colleges, and maintaining your connections with them will help you as a junior or senior when you're thinking about applying to college, and those folks can give you the inside scoop. My second suggestion is tailored to a season that is completely online, which is that you should keep in touch with your fellow students from lab and incorporate regular practice debates into your preseason preparation. A silver lining about this debate season that is completely online is that it's less cumbersome to arrange practice debates with people who are hundreds of miles away, because almost everybody who's attended a debate camp during COVID has a computer, internet, and a mic. Schools that don't have a deep bench of varsity teams or teams of similar caliber would benefit a lot from keeping in touch with other teams in your lab or your debate camp. And that's especially true if they're friends that don't debate in the same circuit as you. So you can have practice debates to improve your craft or try out new strategies before you break them in person. I would recommend shooting for regular debates, perhaps one a month, and it'll give you the chance to keep up with your friends in lab, which is nice socially, while also increasing your opportunities to debate and practice some of your arguments. I think the next person who's going to go is Klarman.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Klarman. I'm the Assistant Director of Debate at Emory. I'm really excited that we're all here talking about debate stuff, talking about the preseason. I think it's the most fun part of the debate season. My two pieces of advice about post-camp is how is it that we create all of the files that we have and that we need so that you can show up at your first tournament and figure out what is happening. So the first thing that I want to say is there is a lot of evidence that has been put out there. And if you go to the Open Evidence Project, you can download the evidence that a bunch of camps have put out. There will be camps constantly putting stuff out. I think that it is really useful to go through and know everything that exists and everything that is out there and just download the stuff, even if it's not necessarily the file that you want to read, but knowing here are all the possible disadvantages so that you can go in with a 2AC block to all of them, or here is every possible affirmative that a lab has put out, because usually at the season openers in high school, about 90% of the apps were produced by a camp. So just like paying close attention can make those first few rounds a lot easier. Now, my second piece of advice is a little bit in the opposite realm, which is you're about to get 5,000 disads to the death penalty and 5,000 negs to we should do something about legalizing weed or drug courts. And you're like, where do I go with this? I have so much. And the key thing here, I think, is figure out what are the core generics that we want throughout the season that some of the people have been talking about. So like, how do we feel about our T arguments? What critiques do we feel good about? Do we have a core set of disads and counterplans? Maybe we feel we're really good about our process counterplans off of the word enact. And once we've decided that, we can say, okay, well, what are all of the apps that I've looked at that these don't solve, and do targeted specific research there? Because I think one mistake a lot of people make in the preseason is they say, there's this one neg that I have 12 strategies to, and you're like, but what happens if we debate something else? I don't really know. So making sure that you have an argument that you feel practiced and comfortable with against every genre of affirmative, I always find to be a really useful way about thinking about the preseason, so you don't end up really shocked after your first debate. That said, I'm going to turn it back to Ed so that we can start doing some questions.
It seems one of the rhythms of this conversation is really how do we deal with the information overload that we have with all of the evidence that's produced. Brian, you referenced the evidence that's on some of the open source platform. Kristen referenced the notions of the creation of files and the miscellaneous files that we want to go back to. I am interested in helping people starting to comb through that. What are some of the prevalent negative strategies that they should tailor in on refining based upon what you have talked about this summer? So what's my core neg strategy? Or core neg strategies that I should be thinking about now?
I'm negative. I'm prepped out on T enact means Congress and a slew of process counterplans that come off of that. The courts, the executive, the states. It does not seem like a good disad topic. It seems like a good counterplan topic because there's pretty universal agreement that the criminal justice system is not very good. And I would start from that premise and then work backwards and be like, what apps have people written that actually have Congress key warrants? What set of police do the Congress actually have authority over, et cetera? And then you'll realize what specific negatives you need to do.
I think that the climate of police protests has created quite a few new sets of articles and journal entries about the relationship between abolition and criminal justice, policing, and sentencing, as well as a set of authors who talk about the different political economies in relationship to capitalism and the prison industrial complex, as well as Afro-pessimists who are writing about sort of the problems with a focus on reform. So I do think that, one thing that is worth considering is, it's important for this topic in particular, and any topic that is very large, to be a lot more flexible in your negative debating and being able to debate both sort of the critical end of things, the set of counterplans that are necessary, and topicality arguments is a very important way to narrow the set of affirmatives that you've prepared yourself to debate.
So I wanted to remind the people in the audience that please, there is a Q&A section where you can post questions that you may have, and I will definitely share those with our panelists as we work through some other questions that some other people forwarded us in advance. I'm interested in your thoughts on this topic. A few of you have referenced the size, scope of it from the AF sections. What do you think constitutes a good AF on this particular topic and to start the year? And what criteria would you use in order to assess that?
It seems like one of the major things that you want to think about when writing an AF is how you're going to have an angle to answer both of the things that Klarman and Shree just brought up. You want to have a good angle against all of the counterplans out of the word enact. And you want to have a good angle against the Ks that you think people are going to be going for a lot, like the abolition K. And so if your app has a good answer to both of these things, then you're probably in a pretty good position. Since there are there's just a ton of literature right now about things that you can change within the federal government, it should be interesting to see what people kind of pull up that has to do, like, relate with criminal justice reform, but you just want to make sure that you're certain that you have an answer to both of those strategies.
Piggyback on what Maggie said, I also think that in some ways you're trying to accomplish the same thing in answering both of those. The really central core reason why the mechanism the federal government uses to do the ask is the only one that would redress whatever the ask is trying to solve. And in general, I think people often start affirmatives thinking about advantages too frequently. And Ed, who was my college debate coach, gave me one of the best pieces of advice I've ever gotten about writing ask, which is you should write ask from the best counterplan backwards. And to Klarman's point about how important counterplans and mechanism and agent counterplans will be to this topic, make sure that when you start writing something, you don't get enticed by the advantages and you answer the question, will it answer the best counterplan? Will it answer the best alternative to a critique? And you have to be able to start there, because otherwise you're going to waste a ton of time, get to that question and be like, oh, that's definitely where I should have jumped off.
Yeah, following what Kristen was saying, in the lab I was teaching this summer, we were constantly saying that everyone had learned the speeches wrong. The affirmative gives one speech, it's called the 2AR, and the first time they give it is in the 1AC, and the second time they give it is in the 2AC, the third time they give it is in the 1AR, and the fourth time is the 2AR. So if you're writing your 1AC concerned about what your 1AC says, something has gone awry. You're worried about what is my 2AR against every single position.
Do you have an example of an app that seems to have been written, that seems to have been popular, that meets some of the things that you're speaking to?
I'm happy to give a quick example of an app that we literally wrote from the 2AR backwards for this high school topic. So we started our lab by saying, let's put up a board. Here's every possible app anyone can think of. And then you'll tell us what the 2AC and 1AR, 2AR are to the following counterplans. We wrote an affirmative that was to make the Capitol Police transparent on the sole basis that it had answers to all of these counterplans and critiques. It was not until week 2 that we found an advantage to the affirmative. But that was not a concern. We were just like, we have all of these cards that say the courts can't do this. The states can't do this because it's not in their jurisdiction. The executive can't do this. It has this set of answers to critiques. And we were just like, we'll figure out the 1AC. It'll come together. They have to win something that outweighs or solves the case. And we have a lot of no link cards. And that's just an example of, like, some people think I want to have a really big advantage that I'm going to weigh against everything. Some people say, I just don't want anything that I'm weighing it against, and I'll figure that out later.
So we have a couple of questions from the audience. One that I'd like for you to entertain. They're asking about tips for maximizing speaker points. And I think that we can answer this in 2 ways. I think that there's the general, how do I maximize speaker points that would be asked at any moment of time debate cycle. But there's also the, I am communicating through a computer to 5 other people. How do I maximize speaker points, understanding that?
I can start with the latter, which is, I think that in a world of Zoom, speaking is all the more important, and the ability to persuade somebody who is hundreds of miles away behind a computer screen is a much more difficult job. You know, keeping the attention of somebody who is right in front of you is already pretty difficult, but, you know, doing that with somebody who may or may not be particularly accountable to you requires you to do a much better job speaking. I think, you know, one very important thing in terms of speaking is, you know, clarity. And that's true across the board, obviously. But in sort of the computerized realm, it's much more important, and the emphasis needs to be on going slower, having emphasis, you know, being, you know, able to clearly distinguish every syllable, because otherwise the judge will have no idea what you're saying. And that's especially compounded by, maybe like, weird internet situation, your computer is not amazing. The sort of important thing here is to, make sure that you're as clear as possible so that whatever is transmitted through the computer is still, okay to listen to. The second thing that I would suggest is doing a bunch of practice debates, especially with the technology that you have. So, debate is a persuasive activity. So it would be nice, for example, for you to be able to look at the camera while you're speaking so that it looks like you're looking at the judge. Even small things like that, and sort of optimizing and making sure your technology is just right and you know how to interact with it, I think is a really important part of getting speaker points this year.
I agree so fully with that, and I'm going to jump on this one because I in real life work as a communications consultant, and part of what I do right now is teach executives how to have presence on Zoom calls and in this new digital age. And I think that that's super important for debate, is how you convey who you are and what you're about, and so much of that intangible component of speaking well in debate. And I have two pieces of advice for you. And one is to treat this interaction you have between you and your laptop as if there is an audience there. And imagine you are in the finals of the Barkley Forum. There are hundreds of judges and students looking at you. And remember that just because you're in the confines of your bedroom, you're not really. And even if it means like drawing out on pieces of paper, little people behind you, whatever situates you mentally in that place, don't forget that you are putting on a show to some degree because you've worked really hard to demonstrate knowledge that you want to convey through authority and confidence. The second thing that I think is important is to not lean into tech helplessness. This is a thing that some people really embrace, and I think we no longer have the ability to identify with, because there's so much information available on the internet to help you deal with your tech problems, and you'll lose a lot of time if you over embrace the idea that like, oh, I'm just not good at computers. It's like being good at computers, not a natural born skill. People didn't even have these decades ago. So embrace a willingness to learn how to optimize your technology for you and say, I am tech savvy, I can handle this. And that sort of confidence also carries when you communicate with people, so that you don't seem flustered if something goes wrong and people trust that you have the situation under control. That'll really help your credibility when you're in situations with tech misfunctions.
I think this was heavily implied in what both Kristen and Shree said, but keeping your video on during the debate helps so much. When you're judging a debate and it's just like, oh yeah, I'm judging a debate where it's just me and 18 black squares around me. It's so difficult to tell so many things. It's hard to tell when people are emphasizing a lot of the time. You might be noticing that a few of us are hand gesturing when we think something is important, because a lot of communication is nonverbal. And also, like, when no one has their camera on, the judge is like, okay, well, I'll just minimize the call, and then who knows what else is going on in their computer. So you definitely don't want that to happen. The second thing that I would emphasize along with tech savviness is like, speaker points are always better when I walk into a room and the 1AC is sent, when during cross-ex, everyone sends out their docs so that there is no just like, oh yeah, I need to send out the OneAR now. And it's like, what have you been doing for the last 8 years during the 2NC and cross-ex? Like, let's get it going. So just to say, showing that you know how things work goes a longer way than you would think. And there are a lot of things that are not just what are the words I said or how I said them that impact speaker points, which is just looking confident, looking engaged, looking enthusiastic. Your partner's talking, you're nodding along. Your opponent's talking, you're like, not true. Just some of that can help both in credibility and argumentation.
Yeah, there are studies, and just to where Brian's at, that indicates that 7% of what we say and what gets communicated is through the words that we say, the literal words that gets transmitted from what the sender sends, what the receiver receives. 38% is what the tone is, just inflection, being animated, a sense of tone of what you're saying and how you are saying it. 38% of what gets communicated that way. 55% is through nonverbals. And so as you're operating within these boxes, you have to figure out how to convey a nonverbal expression of your ideas. And Brian is absolutely correct. And Kristen, you can't identify or have a sense of presence if you are thinking about yourself as being small or not being in a box or limiting your purview. I think that you have to think about how you're being portrayed through this particular medium and how it happens, because it's not just the words that you're saying. We had another question from the audience, and it's about extending an argument or using a speech to its fullest. And I'm interested in thinking about are there some suggestions that you can have for people now that I can do now to help my speeches that's going to happen at the first tournament? Maybe it's, Brian, your notion of thinking about the 2AC as being an extension of the 2AR. What should I be doing in the 2AC? How I should be thinking about it in extending my AF in the 2AC. Maybe, Shree, it's the abolition K that we're thinking about that will have broad utility. What are ways in which I can improve extending those arguments in the middle part of the debate, preparing to extend those arguments so that they are fuller in their utility on the back end of the debate?
I think one of the biggest things about extending the utility of your speech is thinking about at the get-go, especially in some constructives and early rebuttals, is this argument going to be my last speech? Like, you know, I made 7 answers to the politics DA. If they concede this argument, could I give a 5-minute 2AR explaining this argument on why we should win because the politics DA has 0 risk? If the answer to that question is no, that argument maybe should not be in the 2AC in the first place. And it maybe means that, you know, we need to think about that a little bit ahead of time and prepare. We, in our lab and at camp, always taught students that every argument that is in the 2AC needs to be, if conceded, the only argument you make there in the 1AR, and you can move on. And if your argument does not accomplish that, that argument might not be a good argument. Simultaneously, when we think about making 1AR choices or making 2NR choices, or making block choices on the case, it often comes down to we need to consolidate to fewer arguments, which means we should think every argument that we make in the 2AC, we have a few 1AR cards. Every argument on case we make in the 1NC, we have a few 2NC cards. And so much of speaking happens before you start speaking. It's just like, so much of it is preparation. And I think we have all coached and or debated as individuals who aren't great at speaking, but did a lot of prep. Some people here are actually good at speaking. I am not. But if you do enough prep and you're like, I've given this speech 50 times so that when you stand up to give it, you've been there, you've done that. It really gives you a lot of confidence and it makes it a little bit easier to do.
I would like to dispel the notion that Brian was a bad speaker, because it's categorically not true, having debated with him. He was great and he's doing a good job here in the way that you all should. And his ability to speak with a strong sense of purpose is something I highly recommend you adopt. But I do also want to say, extend is such a strange, like, I understand why we call it extending, because you take the argument, you put it in the next speech, it literally moves forward, but it's also such a misrepresentation of what it means to extend an arg, because it's not like putting a pawn forward on a chessboard where it doesn't interact with anything else. The whole purpose of extending an arg is that it no longer exists alone. It exists in comparison and contrast to the other team's argument. Don't think of it as like, I just need to get it into the next speech. Like, it just has to get there. It doesn't. So when you're thinking about extending arguments, a real sort of level up component of that part of the debate is making sure you're asking, well, how is this argument in comparison to theirs? If the judge saw both of these things, why would mine make more sense to them? Why is mine more important than theirs? Why is mine a more credible source of authority on this issue? And that's a question about evidence quality, evidence authorship, but it's also a question about how the arguments analytically compare to each other. What have they not thought of? And asking the questions about your argument in reference to the other team's responding argument is the most important part of an extending an argument. So don't just shoot it out there and be like, we got it. It was in the 2AC, it's on the flow. Make sure you capitalize on that time to start integrating layers of argument and response. And that's what makes a really good extension of something that you put out in a constructive.
I just want to add on to something that Kristen said. You also want to think about the ways in which your arguments interact with each other. like from a negative perspective, when you make the 1 and C, you want to think about how everything interacts with each other. You want to think about which case arguments you can go for in the 2NR with a disad or with a K that will be enough for you to win the debate. You want to think about maximizing the possible 2NR options that you have, in the same way that you want to think about maximizing the different defensive arguments you can go for against disads or counterplans or Ks in the 2AR. And so you want to, this is like what Klarman was saying, you want to do all this preparation beforehand, but kind of maximizing the amount of good arguments you have in the 1AC, 1NC, and 2AC to kind of allow you to set up a bunch of really good 2NRs or 2ARs will go a long way in making those later speeches successful.
I'll add 2 more things. The first is, I think 1AR block writing is pretty important, especially on this topic. You know, if your negative strategy is going to largely be a set of counterplans that compete off of enact, making a set of 1AR blocks that are about competition and the word enact are probably important for you. You probably do not want to do that on the fly, right? You want to be as efficient as possible, you know, as precise as possible in your language, etc. So, you know, doing some of that preparation and legwork, as you know, all the other panelists said, is super important in being successful and writing good extensions. The other thing is something that my fellow Blab leader John Turner makes fun of me for, which is the cult of the redo. I actually think it's good to, redo your speeches, re-give your speeches, especially things like the 1AR, where you need to have very precise and efficient language, and sort of practicing that, I think, makes perfect. And a lot of times in high school debates, at least for me, it seems like most of these core questions are not necessarily just, decided based off the quality of your evidence, but the quality of the debating. And that is sort of the thing that, really differentiates good from great.
I'm still thinking about Kristen's notions of not thinking about arguments as a static component that moves from one place to another, but the evolution of that argument, and how are you encouraging, facilitating the evolution of arguments as the debate progresses. And it leads us in the direction of another question that was asked us, is around the process of innovation. We spent some time on the front end of talking about, here are the arguments that were researched, comb through those, figure out how to process, figure out how to deal with the information overload. How do we innovate beyond that? What are some suggestions that you have for how people can engage in the process of argument creation, argument innovation beyond the file set that is already produced?
It seems like on this topic, a lot of argument innovation is going to come kind of naturally with all of the articles that are being written right now on criminal justice reform. But I think that it might be helpful to think about innovation, not like you write a new app for every tournament or you write a new counterplan or disad, but how can you expand the set of arguments that you already have to come up with new interesting impacts or links to kind of diversify, just as you would in a 1NR, read a bunch of new interesting cards about the argument that you want to extend, instead of like reading 10 off-case positions in the 1NC. You want to continue to do research on the things that you've kind of built something of at the beginning of the season, and try to create, if you're good at going for those things in the 2NR, new scenarios for them.
I agree with that. And I also think innovation gets in some ways easier as the year goes on, because you get to innovate around an objective. And you'll notice I'm very like tethered to intention and goals, but the idea of starting the season and you're like, I have to write a thing that answers like maybe some of the camp stuff, but also who knows what, like that. I am the anti-Brian. I hate the preseason. It is so stressful. I like my hair starts falling out. I lose sleep. The preseason is awful because there's so much to be afraid of. And then once you're in the season, you're like, this counterplan won 10 debates at the last tournament. I've never seen it before. I'm going to write an app that beats that counterplan because these people I want to beat keep going for it. And it gets so much more specific, right? You have objectives. You're like, ooh, this is winning a lot of debates, or I found this because of something someone else did. And you should absolutely take inspiration from other people. And that means going through new files that get read. There is so much evidence available to you that was not available to previous generations of debaters, that you can comb through, read the articles, figure out who the authors are, and either appropriate and modify ideas in a way that builds on them, or might inspire you to find something different entirely. So comb through the wiki, read what people are doing, and then also innovate with intention around types of arguments you want to beat, make better, etc. And attaching an objective to that really helps you tailor your research process so that it doesn't feel like the weird preseason, like you're wandering through a forest and everything's horrible vibe, because like I feel you in that sense. But Brian loves it, so maybe he has advice for you.
To build off of what Kristen's saying, I really think knowing what everyone else has read is just so important. So much of debate is about information deficits, or like we know something that you don't know. And just if you go into a debate and you are debating a counterplan that someone has been reading since round 1 and it's round 6 or it's the next tournament or whatever, and you didn't know that, that is a recipe for things to go poorly. And I think like after every other tournament or once a month, you just got to do the like, we're going to go through the wiki and see what's going on. And that doesn't mean like you read every card closely, but just we have some concept of what these different arguments that people are making are. I think that the corollary, my favorite way to innovate, especially on high school topics, is you take this set of counterplans. People are going to start making solvency deficits. They're going to start writing advantages that they pretty clearly don't solve. All of those advantages are going to be about certainty and signaling. And then you cut impact turns. And you just keep producing impact turns to whatever the solvency deficits are, so that now you don't need your politics DA to be a net benefit to the court's counterplan. You're impact turning their advantage. And having that is also a really nice threat to deter 2As from reading add-ons, breaking new AFs, etc. Because they're like, who knows? This team will do anything. No one knows what's going to happen. We go in reading something, we come out, the debate was about high food prices good. How did we get there? No one's clear. But having some of those threats in your pocket kind of means that you control the direction that innovation goes. And I think one thing that we've all mentioned earlier is, you know, the ability to go for a variety of arguments lets you control how people innovate. So making sure that you're not just innovating against apps that you're already good on, but you're innovating so that you can deal with a variety of different strategies and threaten a variety of different strategies to force people to develop in the way that you want them to.
That explains a lot about the DDI tournament we just had, this past weekend. I think that one of the sort of things important in thinking about innovation in particular is, I think a lot of times people think about innovation like we're breaking a new advantage, or, we just have this like innovative area that has no impact defense. That's something that I want to, suggest that you avoid. Most of sort of your focus on innovation should be innovating around how people are going to fiat and reasons why the counterplan solves, right? So, if you're going to debate a set of agent counterplans pretty regularly, your innovation should be focused on innovating and changing sort of the ways that you're going to describe why the affirmative is not solved by the counterplan. So, perhaps like, one of the sets of affirmatives that fall into this, bucket might be a set of courts affirmatives that have some built-in arguments about why the, executive is bad, or shifting and having a different set of different set of like military jurisdictions or the Coast Guard or something like that, and then innovating sort of based around buckets of affirmatives that don't sort of get immediately solved by counterplan fiat is sort of the way that I would suggest thinking about innovation.
One last small thing that I would add that is very related to what Shree just said: you don't want to innovate into a place where you don't know what your opponent is going to say. You want to innovate into a place where you've picked what they're going to say. So like if you were preparing for a specific set of teams, being like, oh, here is an affirmative that we can read that will link to the following off case they have, but not the other following off case that they have, so we know where the debate will head, can be really, really, really nice. Trying to innovate in a way where you're just like, let's just get to somewhere where we haven't thought about it, they haven't thought about it, and just let the cards fall as they may, can lead to some very weird debates. And a really nice thing about being AF is you can be like, I want to game plan this to the 2AR so that my 1AC has only relevant cards that I'm going to extend in the 2AR. And part of the way of doing that is being like, okay, we're going to read this AF where we know exactly what they're going to say and we know where they think their cards are good, and we have a trick.
One quick thing that I'll add is that it is a misnomer that there are lone wolf innovators. There are actually close to near zero of them, that all innovation operates within relationships, particularly those that are successful, profound, and transformative. And so as you're thinking about this within the debate context, think about how do you share arguments and have conversations about arguments with other people, and how do you have a conversation partner who is going to be honest with you about the ways in which an argument can be improved, who is going to be thoughtful about the ways in which there are holes and deficits within the argument, but is also interested in figuring out how to move that forward and put forward challenges. And so I think a critical component of this is really finding someone who is willing to read over an incomplete set of arguments and then offer challenges, critiques, criticisms about where it is at that particular moment and how things can unfold. That we have had a set of arguments that, at least with work that I've been doing this summer, that has been radically transformed just by that, by offering it up for criticism and having other people read through it and say, I like this section, I don't like this section. What about if we move that along to this particular place? And that's what makes innovation move forward, because they're going to filter that through their own set of ideas around what good argument is, what utility is, where we're going forward, and how that moves forward, and that's useful as well in getting the multitude of perspectives that are there. We have one other question here that's around folks with limited squad size. Squad is small, a limited number of debaters who are in the open division. Maybe it's a very large novice pool. And so what they're interested in is in whether or not you have some ideas about how do you split up assignments for the preseason? What is the best way to coordinate with and think about it within that limited partnership around cutting AFs, doing case negs, doing new files? Do you have some suggestion of managing the load amongst a small squad?
I got some. For a little bit of background, for you all, went to high school without a coach and just my partner and myself on a debate team. So we were as small gets, and we spent a lot of time thinking about how do you handle assignments, how do you delegate. I imagine that the person who asked this question probably is dealing with a bit more than that if you're thinking about divvying assignments, but I do have a couple of pieces of advice for you. The first one is that research is like exercise, and the routine that works best for you is the one that you will actually do. Whatever anyone else says, it's like if you are told that the right way to do research is 100 hours a week and you're not going to do it, don't sign yourself up for that. Don't give assignments to people who are flagrantly telling you it is above their skill level or interest. That being said, you should always try to challenge the people around you and give people things that will let them grow, but don't delegate important projects to people who are acting like they can't take them. I think one of the problems people who have high volumes of novice teammates and sort of low volumes of open teammates sometimes encounter is they want to help people, but they end up feeling resentful because they gave something important to someone who was like, I'm not ready for this. And let people tell you what they can and can't handle, and people will rise to the occasion if they can, and they won't if they don't feel confident enough to. That being said, outside of capability and willingness to take files, you have to be smart. And that, to me, and like the reason I find this question so good is tethers back to that point of being intentional. Don't do everything because you can't. Ask, what are the arguments we keep losing to? What are the asks that like we're not beating? Can we sort of conceptualize things in buckets or categories that might make our preps more efficient? Can someone take a component of the topic where we know that we only want to improve one strategy, give them the core of it and say, hey, we need better links to these 5 things. But being as specific as you can when you delegate across the board is always a good idea. And then being as certain as you can be that the thing you're delegating achieves an objective you're working towards will save you a lot of the like fluff assignments that didn't matter and like you weren't sure, you just knew that you maybe needed it. Be intentional, be specific with your instruction, and make sure that you're also giving assignments to the people who are going to get them done, and develop a culture of accountability for assignments on your team, because otherwise no one gets anything done, and that could be a real serious issue as the season evolves.
I also went to a high school where it was basically me and my debate partner that did all of the policy debate research on our team. And I completely agree with everything Kristen said. And I just want to like expand a little bit more on the intentionality of choosing which research assignments that you do. because before you can even get to the point of delegating assignments between the two of you, you want to make sure that you're using that time in a useful way and choosing the right things to work on for a team that's kind of small. And something that was really helpful for us when I was a senior in high school, it was the China topic, if anybody can remember back doing that. But we chose an AF that we knew exactly what everybody was going to go for against it, just like what Klarman was talking about to answer to the last question. And we knew exactly what linked to the AF. We knew that there was a lot of good literature on both sides of the arguments that you could go for, but most importantly, we knew what the 2NR was going to be, because we knew that as long as we could kind of develop good answers to whatever the 2NR was, even if they had good cards, we would just out practice them on debating these arguments.
Yeah, I think going off of that, I was at a school that we had a very young team when I started, and then we had a very old team with a lot of resources my senior year when I was in high school, which was like, experienced some different sides of this. If you are reading the same AF that a lot of big schools are reading, no one is going to do a specific neg to your AF, and you know what other people are going to say to you. This obviously isn't the case if you're like, we're one of the top 5 teams in the country, but if you're like, we're a team that's trying to clear, we're a team that's somewhere around that area, and you're like, we're reading the same AF that MBA is, or that Westminster is, or that one of those other large schools is, you know what people's negs are because they're reading the same thing that they're reading against those schools, which in some ways, like Maggie and Kristen are saying, makes it very easy to organize the direction in which you want to go, which can be really, really nice. Alternatively, if you read a very small particular AF, every big school is going to look at your AF, decide if they want to cut it for themselves, because they're going to be like, oh, this is a small tricky thing that only one person's reading. And they may end up cutting a neg to it that you could debate 35 different specific negs to your AF. Now that can be good if you're like, I'm really in the weeds on this one thing. They want to keep talking about this. I have my own weird spin on it. I think I can get away with it. But if you're a person who needs to have blocks to everything, picking an AF where you know what people's neg are is so helpful. If you're a person who's like, I'm okay talking on the fly, I don't need blocks, I'd rather be right about this one thing that I know a lot about, maybe you want to look somewhere else. But thinking about your strengths and weaknesses and what the mentality of your opponents is going to be can really help drive some of your decision making.
I think that in general, when thinking about a limited size team and negative arguments, you want to sort of focus not on trying to generate specific case negatives to literally every single AF out there. That's largely an impossible task, especially given the size of this topic. And considering how little sort of, I thought that, for example, on most other topics, if you look at the Michigan camp files and the DDI camp files and other camp files, the affirmatives tend to be pretty similar. I think this topic is pretty different in that way, and that a lot of AFs are very different. And I think what people thought was the core of the topic was very different from camp to camp, primarily because there's not really a core. And I think that requires you to cut a number of negative arguments that are able to sort of corner the set of affirmatives that you're going to focus on. So let's say, for example, that you feel really good about debating T and ACT as only the Congress. Like, you can prepare that, have a very extensive file, and then be like, okay, I feel okay about winning this argument. Maybe that means that, I can put a pin on some of these courts AF for another time. I need to focus on the other affirmatives that, would not, that this T argument would not be good against. And then that allows you to sort of slowly corner the set of negative strategies and research that you need to do that is much more specific. And I think that's sort of the thing that I would recommend for some of the teams that have sort of a smaller size, is to pick a couple of generics that sort of cover a wide variety of areas and try to cast that net, and then focus on writing case negatives that for AFs that don't really apply to those sort of general areas.
So I think we have time for one other question from our audience. And they're interested in, and I think that I don't think we have nearly enough time to explore this, but it's a good place to start. That AF positions and engaging those that are related to one's personal experience. Particularly, I'm guessing, in the context of this topic, where the way in which I'm going about debating the AF is to talk about my relationship to the criminal justice system, police brutality, the way in which racism has informed my family relationships, my community, what are some ways in which I, as the negative, or the negative, can or should engage those conversations that wouldn't come across as being disparaging their experience?
I think topics that have a relationship to personal experience, you need to sort of approach them with respect, with care, with sophistication. You don't want to sort of go in with a blunt-edged object. You want to, make sure that you're sort of, the way you're coming across is respectful, and you're sort of engaged in the material that you're debating. One sort of strategy that I have is, yes, affirmatives will oftentimes touch on areas of personal experience, but one of the things that you want to sort of focus on is how the affirmative claims to solve some of the issues that they've brought about. I think that making a set of counterpoint arguments or critique arguments that are not disparaging to the experiences of the people that are there, but rather challenge sort of the ways that affirmatives seek to solve the problem are sort of the best approaches, at least in my mind, in terms of negative strategy for those kinds of affirmatives.
There is also plenty of literature that exists on what the relationship between the personal or experience ought be and our concepts of politics. So there are people who say that we ought make decisions solely based on what personal experience is. There are people who say we ought never consider personal experience. There are people who say that there are a variety of ways that it is strategic to employ. There are people who say we should or should not be considered with that. Having a few different ways that you're ready to say what should the relationship between personal experience and decision-making look like could put you in a position to have an engaged debate about what does it mean to have personal experience as it relates to something. So like there are a bunch of Marxists and other people who write about capitalism who criticize a focus on the individual. There are a bunch of post-structuralists who criticize the idea that the individual as such even exists. So like when I write a story and then I tell that story a year later, am I even the same person? And there are plenty of different ways that you could say, I want to address this question of experience. That said, I wouldn't put it on yourself or expect it to be reasonable that you're going to know everything that exists in the library of people who write about experience. And I think that if you think the threshold for engagement is we have to have something to say exactly about what our opponent says, you're putting it a little bit too high. So I think that finding either what is the relationship between experience and action, what is the action they're saying we ought do, and do we have issues with that, are going to be easier places to contest and just like more researchable and a little easier for you to move forward strategically.
What, Chris?
I was just going to say I have some attitudinal advice, which is A, don't be scared of the opportunity to learn about people who have different experiences than you, who might share that experience. That is an incredible thing to be able to receive as a high schooler, that a lot of us debated topics that never really afforded us when we were your age. And it's cool, embrace it. And if you feel unequipped for it and you don't know if you're going to walk into a round and disparage someone by reading an argument, consider that outside of just debate research, there's so many good resources, and especially in this political moment, that can help you understand how to navigate conversations about experience and difference. There are books, there are podcasts, whatever your preferred medium for intaking knowledge is. I highly consider you pursue tools that give you more confidence in heading into those conversations.
Yeah, I have one quick thought here. I think thinking about these conversations are thinking about the app as part of a social movement and trying to process this through the theory of social movements. In fact, that has become much easier these days with where we are as a country. There are lots of people who are writing in newspapers, writing in magazines around how social movements function and operate. And so thinking about the AF and its relationships to the goals and strategies of a particular social movement and whether or not it furthers the agenda of that movement or thwarts that particular movement, and you as the negative wants to be able to make some arguments around how the particular set of strategic choices, whether rhetorical, whether from a positionality perspective, whether from the ways in which they build relationships across communities, how does that impact a particular social movement? And so I think that there are opportunities that are much easier to access for arguments here because of the moment that we're in, but I do think it's going to require doing some reading and being up on top of where we are and what's going on. And so we are so I think we have 3 minutes left, and I think in closing, we can go around because there's a one final question that we have in the chat, and I think it's a good one to end our question on. That's around the essentials for entering a large tournament. So when you're entering in a big tournament, what are some of the essential things that you want to make sure that you do that week of or those 2 weeks of before in preparing? And so we've talked about at this particular point, now we are entered into a tournament. What are some of those essential things, one or two things that you think people need to do in order to make sure that they're going to be successful at that tournament where there's that large collection of teams, some of them you've never debated before?
I think one thing we haven't talked about at all that you want to do the week before the tournament is you need to have the time where you kind of shift away from card cutting into making sure your cards are highlighted, making sure that you are sleeping normally, making sure that you are eating and doing the other health things, and even thinking about like, okay, I'm having 3 or 4 online debates today. Am I going to have time for these lunch breaks? Do I need to pre-plan and pre-organize those things and realize that there are a lot of social and non-just debating aspects that are necessary for your debate tournament to work. So like making sure that you have planned, organized, maybe communicated with your parents or other people who you live with about what your schedule is going to look like, kind of just the things that we all forget about because when we go to a tournament, our debate coaches take care of all of that. And maybe that also means communicating with your debate coach and being like, what time do I need to be on the virtual bus? Do we need to check in? Do I have a buddy system that I call my partner at a certain time to make sure that they're also awake? And, you know, just don't forget that there is a lot of stuff that goes into it other than just preparing your files. That's very important.
I would just add that a lot of times you can see all the teams that are also signed up for tournaments, and you can go through all of these open sourced like websites that we have now for debate, and just make sure 2 weeks before that you feel comfortable if teams have their AFs up, like have something to say against everything, that you feel like you're in a good place, and then also like checking what teams have said against your AF, making sure that you are like kind of updated on everything that's happened.
I think one of the things that's interesting about this season in particular is that I think the big tournaments are truly large. So like the Ohio Valley tournament last year was about 60 to 70 teams. This year it looks like upwards of 150. Like I've seen some divisions that look like 200, 250 teams, which is much larger than we might have had otherwise. And I think that's one of the silver linings of online debate is that it's afforded the ability of students to access more of these tournaments. I think the thing that you sort of want to think about when approaching a tournament of that, you know, size or scale is you want to do sort of preparation realistically. So, you know, you're obviously not about to go in and do 250 case next. That's, you know, that's insane, right? So you want to sort of focus on teams that are around and near your bracket. So, you know, one thing that really helped me is at least looking at, you know, teams that I think would do very similarly to me, maybe teams that are, you know, one step above, one step below, and making sure that you've done sort of research in those areas and making sure that you're ready to go if, you know, a few days before you're trying to prioritize a set of case links. It happens to the best of us, right? It's like we start prepping 3 days before and we're like, all right, where do we start? That's the place where you want to start and make sure that you're ready to sort of compete at these sort of large events.
Get some sleep. That's the big one. Klarman said it. If you're prepared, but you're delusional because you're tired, you're no good. Get some sleep. That's my biggest piece of advice.
So I want to thank the audience for the awesome questions and helping to move this conversation forward. And Shree, Maggie, Kristen, Brian, thank you for sharing your experience, your wisdom, all that you've gained this summer, and helping people who are online to have an awesome debate season. And so this concludes our presentation. And thank you all for being here. And I hope to hear from everyone soon. You all have a great week of our year of debating. Bye-bye.